In the tarot deck printing traditions that we see today, I've talked about Rider-Waite-Smith style decks, I've talked about Marseille style decks. Those are pretty clear transmissions of a way to design a deck. Later, we get decks that are much more of a hybrid and that are even working in ideas from very particular traditions. So let's take a look at the Wildwood Tarot as a good example of both a hybrid and something that is inspired by a tradition that was really outside of the Rider-Waite-Smith's territory when they were putting together their deck based on the Order of the Golden Dawn and their correspondences. So the Wildwood Tarot is based much more on Northern European Celtic symbols, mythology, and concepts. To start with, the suits are all different from what is familiar in most decks. Instead of coins or pentacles, you've got stones. Rather than staffs or wands, bows. Instead of swords, arrows. And instead of cups, vessels. So it takes these more socially informed material things and places them in a much more nature-centric kind of perspective. And that's really a lot of what this deck is trying to get across, is a much more natural feel, a sense that your relationship with spirituality, divination, everything that you're seeing in these cards should be related in some way to the way that you involve yourself with nature, how you place yourself in it, and what these big natural themes mean in your life. Although you'll see that throughout the deck, there are a lot of points to the symbols that you see, or the concepts really, that you find in Pamela Coleman Smith's drawing of the miners. So one example is the Four of Stones is protection. This is a slightly different way of looking at the character in the Four of Pentacles, who is kind of hunkering down underneath the treasure, or surrounded by treasure on all sides, but in a much more physical way. You know, the cash that this wealthy-looking character at the center of the Four of Pentacles has is protecting him from disaster, social problems, and need. This is a much more physical sense of protection in that this fawn can't be approached from any side without it knowing about it or without some obstacle being in the way. So similar concepts, but much more directly related to natural relationships. I also really like that the court cards in each of the suits, instead of being actual court characters, you have animals. So we have the lynx as the Page of Stones, the bear as the Queen of Stones, the horse as the Knight of Stones, and the wolf as the King of Stones. So again, here we're transported out of the human social world and the context that that would relate to when we're thinking about these cards, and instead put into a world where the attitudes, the behavior of these animals is what's going to invest those cards, their meaning, the way that we feel about them, the energy we're getting off of them, rather than us thinking directly about people and the way that they affect us. So just from the court cards alone, not to mention the rest of the suggestions about humanity and nature, but just the court cards are going to put people in a very different position when they're looking at a spread and thinking about, instead of, well, I've got this kingly figure here, and he's got a staff, he seems serious but interesting and energetic. Instead, we are looking at the adder as the king of bows. Thinking about a ball of snakes is going to give somebody a very different emotive experience than thinking about a guy who seems sexual, creative, energetic, and looking to make an impact on the world. I do appreciate that you get a little tag down here as a keyword for each card. I feel like that's nice when a deck points to a particular tradition. It's giving us some concepts to grab onto without too much interpretation of the card to help a person get through a reading, especially a newer reader or somebody who is using this deck more because they're deeply into the Celtic tradition rather than somebody who focuses a great deal on tarot, is already familiar with the concepts and the models of the cards and is trying to see how these artists express it. I could definitely see somebody picking up this deck in order to enhance their embeddedness with the Celtic world, Celtic symbols, other people who have studied these things and portrayed them in the context of the tarot. The majors create a fairly different framework than what we're familiar with in, again, the more socially informed Marseille or Whitesmith decks. The Fool is the wanderer, not going over a cliff per se, nor pursued by a dog, but in this case going over a rainbow, walking this ethereal misty path into a dense wooded area. It looks to me like this person has found a way into one of the Celtic otherworlds, maybe going to visit the fairies. It's not so much a question of, is this person foolish or misled or wandering about with no direction? No, in this case, they are going somewhere, but the question in the framework of this world is, how are they going to come back? How human will they still be? Are they going to bring anything with them? What kinds of gifts, diversions, permutations are the Fae going to lay on this person? And I do like that it hints to a strong concept of transformation, that when you go on a journey, when you lose yourself, something is going to be transformed about your life, your potential. The things that you have seen are going to produce a new world that you are seeing again if you return. The Empress and the Emperor are portrayed as the Green Man and the Green Woman. The symbols on their cauldrons anchor them in their sense of natural femininity and masculinity. Instead of the Pope, we have the Ancestor. So again, a very different context for where spiritual wisdom would come from, how one would get it. I do find it kind of interesting that we have the Stag instead of Justice at 8, and the Woodward rather than Strength. Definitely seems to me to point more toward the Marseille ordering of the trump cards rather than, mostly due to this cat-like imagery and the fact that the Stag is a little bit closer to being full-on front and center, like the Justice image. So this deck borrows quite a bit from both the White Smith concepts, especially in the minor cards, but also from the Marseille deck, in that it's much more direct in indicating what tradition it's drawing from, what symbols you ought to make use of in order to understand what's going on in the cards, more like the Marseille deck. The wheel is placed over water, as it is portrayed in many Marseille decks, and I find it particularly fascinating that the wheel is woven, thus indicating the sense that the world is a tapestry, that the weave and the warp of it is what creates all the possibilities and our personal location in the fate of the world. And many of the cards, again, have a very different context than what we're used to in other tarot decks. Instead of the Hanged Man, we've got the Mirror with a mermaid on it. Instead of the 13 as Death, we have the Journey. And yet the sense that the journey takes us beyond the expected, the transformations that the journey enacts upon us are going to bring us into a form that we may not have recognized ourselves in before. So if you're a person that has a lot of deep interest in nature spirituality, in getting a sense of how Celtic concepts, especially as they were enacted in communal ritual forms, because I feel like a lot of that is packed into the deck. Natural community, natural spirituality, natural rituals all come through in the way that the cards are portrayed in the Wildwood Tarot. It's a fabulous deck, especially for folks with ancestry from the British Isles, from any other area in Northern Europe, Scandinavia, Norway, Greenland, Iceland, even northern France. Celts were active there. Though they really spanned a much larger geography than a lot of folks realize. It's just that the Romans were pushing them further and further north in their conquests. Celtic thought moved through a lot of Europe because the Druids liked to move around. They were interested in what other people were doing. They were always trying to learn more and disseminate wisdom. So really anybody of European heritage who's interested in exploring that, I think would be interested in the way this deck puts its symbols together. Anybody who's been following a Wiccan path will surely get a lot out of this deck. So it's flexible, it's general enough to apply to any kind of practice that wants to bring their spirituality closer to nature, and it's an interesting enough tarot deck that you can definitely do fabulous readings for it. Once you get to know it real well, I think that you could get it to talk to just about anybody. I hope you've enjoyed checking out the Wildwood Tarot. It's a great one for people who are more nature-based in their sensibilities. Please contact me for readings if you are ever feeling at a loss, curious, you've got energy to fill and you're not really sure what to use it for. I am more than happy to point you in the direction that your place on the map of reality is currently indicating for you. Have a fabulous day and take care.